Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
All right, folks, welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. And this is Scott Parkin, your co-host in Berkeley, California, joined as always by
Bob Bazanko in Niles, Ohio, and I'm very excited. This is kind of the Green and Red equivalent of the moon landing. We're doing something new tonight.
We are broadening our audience. And we are not only going to be sharing audio, but we're also going to be sharing video on our YouTube channel, Green and Red Podcast. And it's a little bit of an experiment, and it's a little bit of wishful thinking. So just, hope y'all enjoy it.
Yeah, we've been talking about this for a while, and we've finally gotten around to doing it. I think, many of you follow us on Facebook, and Scott and I have been putting up for several months now, kind of little write-ups about radical history, kind of in this day in history. We call them radical history moments. And we thought it would be kind of fun to actually do one on video because it's a very important event and worth talking about in some detail.
Yep. And so today is a momentous anniversary, to say the least. It's the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And we're going to go into a little bit of a kind of background on that. It's a significant date, and we do a lot of radical history here, and so we just want to kind of talk about it a little bit with each other so that you all can listen. And so I'm going to let Bob kind of kick it off.
Okay. Really, I think kind of one of the most important historical events of the entire 20th century. When the bomb was dropped, a lot of people, policymakers, journalists, historians referred to it as day one, like the world had started over again. Because, unlike previous weapons, the atomic bomb had the capacity now to destroy, at the time, even the smaller bombs that they used, 150,000 people in Hiroshima at one time, whole cities at one time. And there was this potential, which they understood, to, destroy entire nations. So wars would be waged differently now. They could be waged instantaneously, spontaneously. You wouldn't necessarily have to mobilize armies and send them to the front. You could destroy who knows what in simply a matter of hours. And, and they understood that it would become even more powerful and with different delivery systems. So it's a big deal is the point here. It's really a big deal. It kind of officially ended the Second World War, obviously, and that's important as well. But the issue of whether the bomb should have been used, why it was used, I think is still with us and still very important because nuclear proliferation continues. And we don't talk about it nearly as much as we did in the Cold War, but it's still kind of a big deal. And I know, Scott, you've studied this as much as I have, and it's a really fascinating historical episode with a whole lots of twists and turns in it. And, what I thought we'd do is just kind of go over the kind of background to it. And then normally we don't do kind of chronologies in history with a lot of dates and timelines, but I think in this particular case, it's kind of useful to do that. Nowadays, if you take surveys or ask people why the atomic bomb was dropped and whether it should have been, you're going to see overwhelming majorities of people, 75%, 80%, maybe more, say that yes, the United States should have used the atomic bomb to end the war. And they did it in order to avoid having to actually continue fighting, especially invading Japan, to have kind of a land war in Japan, which would have been devastating. So the bomb was justifiably used in order to avoid having to continue fighting and to have this really ugly and really bloody land war in Asia. And I think for a long time, even to this date, most people still see it that way. And I think, you probably, when you talk to people or when you read books, that I think unless it's kind of a revisionist history, that's kind of the narrative you're going to see. And I mean, I think you see it in pop culture as well, So what I thought we'd do is talk a little bit about that. And I've written a little bit about it. The United States actually began a major program to develop atomic weapons at the outset of World War II, called the Manhattan Project, which I believe at the time, wasn't it like the largest government program ever, like $2 billion, which was just absolutely immense. And it was put under military control. The Army had control of the Manhattan Project, Leslie Groves. And Britain was brought into it because it was an ally. But then something which I think is important, which is generally left out of the story, is that the Soviet Union was not, even though they were allies to the United States as well. So the British and the Americans were working on this. Now, many of the scientists had come from Europe. In the 1930s, as fascism in places like Germany, of course, in Italy, became more burdensome and more terrifying, a lot of scientists, especially a lot of Jewish scientists, fled. And many went to the Soviet Union, and many came to the United States and to Britain. And so these were the guys who were kind of, in on at ground zero. The names are familiar. Oppenheimer, you throw some names out there too. Niels Bohr, Fermi, Sheldon Cooper, I think, was in on it. Right. So, and they began this. Now, just jumping ahead, by 1945, and the Germans were also working on an atomic bomb. By 1945, it was clear, because all these people had intelligence and surveillance, that Germany wasn't really that close, but the US was. And so this is kind of where the timeline, I think, becomes kind of important. And we'll spend a little bit of time doing that. Now, in 1945, in February, Franklin Roosevelt was still alive, still president, and he met at Yalta with Stalin and Churchill. And the most of the story about Yalta revolves around decisions made regarding Poland and Germany, but something else really important happened there. At that time, the United States was officially fighting against Japan. The Soviet Union was not. They weren't officially combatants in the Pacific War yet, and the U.S. wanted them to be. So at Yalta, go ahead.
And they wanted the goal was to get Stalin and the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan.
Absolutely. They thought this was critical, and we'll talk more about that later. Very critical, actually, and bigger as the story goes on. They absolutely wanted the war in the Pacific. In 1943, 1944, it had turned, but it was, you had battles like at Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, which were very bloody, and it was a different kind of war. And so the U.S. does absolutely wanted the Soviet Union to declare war and start to help against Japan. So at Yalta, and this is in February of 1945, and the dates are actually important here, Stalin agreed. And he said that 3 months after the war in Europe ended, the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan. Now, later on, we'll talk about that because the calendar is kind of important here. So the Soviet Union would agreed at Yalta to enter the war. Now, at the same time, this is in February, March, April, through the spring of 1945, American war planners are trying to figure out how to end the war in the Pacific, which is what they do. And they figure out all the contingencies and everything else. I think what's really important is that one of their first assumptions was that Japan was in desperate shape and wanted out. Because we kind of keep hearing, kind of the I think folklore, I call it, narrative, is that, they were flying kamikaze missions and they were going to fight to the last man and all this kind of stuff. And, but the reality was, and American war planners understood this, they wanted out. They were getting desperate. And in fact, some years ago, not that long ago, a Japanese historian named Tsuyoshi Hasegawa wrote a book called Racing the Enemy, and he looked at new documents. And what he found out actually was that the Japanese were definitely in desperate shape, and they were actually afraid of the Soviet Union more than the United States. They weren't really thinking about an atomic bomb. They feared a Soviet intervention into the war against them. They would rather, in a sense, you've read John Dower, right? They would rather lose to the United States than to the Soviet Union, right? For obvious reasons, right? Because, you've read Dower, the idea. What's a book called? Embracing.
There's embracing defeat.
Yeah.
Which is essentially like it's about the end of the war, and it's about what the steps the U.S. took after the war to sort of like build up a liberal capitalist state.
Yeah.
Partially as one of the many bulwarks against Stalinism and communism.
Yeah.
But one of their concerns that he points out is that by the end of the war, there were 100,000 members of the Japanese Communist Party.
Yeah.
Which was struck fear in many, both in Japan and the United States.
Sure. So, I mean, the idea of the Soviet Union intervening in February sounded good, right? Because the war, they weren't sure what was going to happen. But and these military planners kept saying, well, that's probably going to be decisive. They want out. They're afraid of Soviet intervention. And then what we found out, not long ago from these new books is that, in fact, they were terrified of Soviet intervention. That was absolutely their greatest fear. And so they had also been intercepting Japanese messages, the famous magic encryptions. And they learned that, in fact, the Japanese were making overtures toward the Soviet Union, because they were not, combatants at that point, to try to end this thing. It's kind of ironic. The U.S. had declared that there would be unconditional surrender, right, to avoid kind of the problems after World War I. And Japan had one major condition, which was to retain Hirohito, the emperor, who's a descendant of God. And, that was kind of their one, which they ended up getting anyway, right? Hirohito remained in power. So, but there was a strong push, though, to end the war. All right. So in the spring, U.S. military planners understand the war's not going well for Japan. Japan is desperate. Japan fears Soviet intervention. Right. Then on May 8th is VE Day. The war in Europe ended. Now that's important because Stalin had said 3 months from VE Day, the Soviet Union would intervene. Right. And so jumping forward, what's 3 months from May? It's August, right? Early August. So early August. So you can kind of see where we're heading with this, right? At the same time, these American planners were, if you've ever been in the military or read books about war planning, you come up with all kinds of contingencies. And so in the spring of 1945, in April and May, the planning essentially assumed that if there was an invasion of Japan, the earliest date that the United States could launch a limited invasion, like the Ryukyu Islands, would be November of 1945. So again, these dates are important. A full invasion of Japan, the mainland, could not occur before January 1st, 1946. They also, as planners do, assumed what the damage would be, and they came up with casualty figures somewhere in the 50,000 range from an invasion, and that too will be important as we go on. So
as the story might change, it could change.
Yes, yeah. This is kind of a good detective story, isn't it? It's really kind of fun. When I talk about this, is the only time when I lecture that I actually do this kind of a timeline and thing like that, and students I think get a kick out of it. It's actually one of the more popular things. So yeah. So anyway, then we're in mid-July, and there had been another meeting scheduled. Now Franklin Roosevelt had died in April, so Harry Truman became president. Truman didn't even know about the atomic bomb until he became president. He now has this incredible historical reputation. He's not the brightest bulb, he's not Trumpian by any means, but he's not the brightest guy, and he's very timid. He's very kind of concerned and kind of anxious. He's had this thrust upon him, right? Kind of he was kind of an accidental vice president, and now he's really an accidental president. So he's preparing for this meeting with Churchill and Stalin, which is kind of terrifying. And it's kind of ironic because, the meeting was initially scheduled either for late June or early July. I can't remember the precise date. And the United States kept delaying it, right? So, it kept going on. And I always make jokes to my class. Truman had a dental appointment, and then, he had to go pay his taxes and stuff like that. But they kept delaying it. Finally, they met in mid-July at Potsdam. And weirdly enough, Churchill had lost an election. So like kind of halfway there, he had to leave, and Clement Attlee's there, which is kind of not really that important. But Truman met on July 17th with Clement Attlee and Stalin after all these delays. Now, this is where it gets to be fun, because what happened that very same day in New Mexico?
It's when they test the bomb.
They tested the bomb at Alamogordo.
Yeah.
So after all of this stalling, which the United States claimed had, was just unavoidable and had no meaning. On the date that Truman arrived at Potsdam to meet with the British and Soviet government, the atomic bomb was successfully tested. And Truman's Secretary of State at the time was a guy named James Byrne from South Carolina, I think. Was he also later Supreme Court justice, or wasn't he a justice of the court or something too?
I think he became one later. He became one later.
Big time politician, a real haymaker. And Byrne told Truman. Now it's kind of funny because Truman was very apprehensive and timid. And as soon as he found out about the bomb, he started acting very differently. Vyacheslav Molotov, who was the Soviet foreign minister, got a tongue lashing from Truman. Truman came in and just kind of told him what was what and how it was going to be. And Molotov said, "I've never been talked like that before." And Byrne later wrote, kind of jokingly, he's like, "Well, in Texas, we carry our weapons on our hip." And Truman kind of had the biggest weapon of all on his hip now. He had the atomic bomb, and it changed his entire demeanor and everything else.
I think the exact quote he described it as carrying the bomb around on his hip.
Yeah, like a gun, right?
Like a six gun.
Yeah, and it's like everybody who's written about this has talked about that. So this is in mid-July, right? So while at Potsdam, Truman received word, and he changed his demeanor. He starts giving ultimata to the Soviet Union. Then what happened? Well, on 75 years ago, then on August 6th, the United States exploded the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Not a military target. You've seen photos of it. Absolutely devastated the city, killed about 150,000 people. The date, the timing, is kind of ironic, right? Because now you're at this 3-month mark, and the Soviet Union was deploying. They were getting ready. They're mobilizing, getting ready to enter the war, and in fact declared war immediately afterward. 3 days later, go ahead. I'm sorry. Oh,
no, I was just about to say that. I believe it was like October 8th or 9th where Stalin declares war on Japan.
August, yeah. I think it's the 8th, and then on the 9th, there's another bomb at Nagasaki, and then I think Japan officially surrendered. What was like on the 11th or 12th or something like that. I don't remember that. So again, like that timeline, I think is useful because you see this, kind of all coming into place. Now, this occurred in August, right? Now, the earliest date for the planners that the U.S. could have launched a limited invasion would have been November, and a full invasion in January of 1946. So you're looking, August to November, you still got, 3 months there, 2.5, 3 months, where you could have, if you wanted to try to find some kind of diplomatic solution or, let the threat of the Soviet Union work its magic or whatever. But that didn't happen, right? So in the immediate aftermath, that ended the war. Now, in the immediate aftermath, and this is what I found striking, and if you're interested in this, there's a lot of good stuff on it, but the person who's done the most work is, and I think you've read him too, right? Is Gar Alperovitz. Alperovitz.
It's a tome. I will say that it's over 1,000 pages, so I can't say I read it, but I've read about it, and I've read summaries, and I'm very familiar with it.
I've actually it's a fascinating topic, and Alperovitz has actually put out 3 or 4 books on this, and I've probably read one of the few times I can say this. I've read every word of every page. A lot of people had started, studying this, but Alperovitz is the best known. And I didn't know this until I started reading him. In the immediate aftermath, when they did polling, Americans were actually very much split on whether the bomb should have been used. There was a great deal of consternation because this was, 150,000 people with one bomb. That's, staggering. I think even today that would be, amazing. Look at, how we're stunned by what happened in Beirut, right? So imagine this is like multiple, exponential number of Beirut at the same time. So Americans were kind of split in polling. The kind of National Council of Churches came out with a statement against it. William Buckley Sr. And other conservatives criticized Truman for using the bomb, right? So it wasn't really that positive. He was getting criticized. And we'll talk about this later because I think it's also important. Most of his military advisors, frankly, including people like Eisenhower, Marshall, and even Curtis LeMay, thought it was unnecessary and provocative. So we're in this position. Yeah, go ahead.
Give us a little background on Curtis LeMay. He's in particular. It's interesting that he is one who was cautioning.
Absolutely, Curtis LeMay. He's from Ohio. He's from Ohio State. Actually, there is a Curtis LeMay chair in military history in the Ohio State History Department. He was kind of one of the gurus of air war in the United States. Air war had become popular like in the 1920s, and LeMay was the head of the Army Air Corps before there was an independent Air Force. So in World War II, it was the Army doing all the air attacks. And LeMay was the Air Force Chief of Staff during Vietnam, who, at some point said, let's blow them off the map, let's turn Vietnam into a parking lot, but also actually thought Vietnam was problematic too. But
LeMay was also the architect. There was actually some pretty brutal firebombing of like Tokyo in 1945 before they dropped the bomb, which is one of the reasons they think that the Japanese were like looking for a way out of surrender. But like LeMay was the architect of that firebombing campaign.
In fact, and that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because in both Tokyo and in Dresden in Germany, they were using napalm. Napalm is a gaseous gel. So what they would do is they drop these bombs and then they'd explode, and then the gas would hit them, and they'd create these firestorms. And Dresden and Tokyo were probably hit, in many ways worse than Hiroshima and Nagasaki were. And these are war crimes. There's no doubt about it. And I guess wasn't LeMay also the archetype for Strangelove?
He was for General Ripper, Jack D. Ripper, not Strangelove.
Jack Ripper, okay.
Yeah,
okay,
Strangelove was Kissinger, I guess it was before Kissinger. But
yeah, but I knew he was kind of part of that, because you can't watch Strangelove and not think of LeMay. But even later on, I found out that these guys were really concerned about it. In fact, the scientists before the bomb was even tested, tried to have a meeting with FDR. I believe it was maybe Niels Bohr, I can't remember. And they said that FDR didn't really want to listen to him. He didn't really care what they had to say. And so the scientists were deeply concerned. Some of them suggested doing kind of inviting Japan to Alamogordo to show them, what would happen to them if they didn't surrender. But there was some fear that, well, if it doesn't work, then, we kind of look dumb and all this. Now so after the war, then you have this real, kind of mixed bag in the United States. You have people criticizing it. Public opinion is not necessarily on board. Truman is running for re-election. Things aren't going well. There's a strike wave. The economy's kind of flat. You had Taft-Hartley. The Cold War, right, is ratcheting up. And the United States had been an ally of the Soviet Union, and now they're claiming that the Soviet Union, the communists, are trying to take over the world and everything else. And Truman's kind of not perceived as a strong leader. And this is, I think, in some ways more interesting than the actual story of the bomb itself, right? So the story of the bomb, we haven't been explicit about it, is that, and people like Al Perovitz, and the first person I think to really go public with this was a British physicist named P.M.S. Blackett, who in the late 50s started writing about this. And I think he may have actually even come up with the phrase that Al Perovitz used, which was atomic diplomacy. And Blackett's contention was that the bomb was not necessary to end the war, that the atomic bomb wasn't used as a way to destroy or cause Japan to surrender, but in fact was directed at who? I'm playing professor here.
The Soviet Union.
Yep, it was atomic diplomacy. They didn't want, now after February, after imploring the Soviet Union out of the war, by August, the United States, now that it has sole possession of an atomic bomb, doesn't want the Soviet Union to enter the war, and uses this atomic bomb to send a clear message to Stalin, right? We have a monopoly on this really horrific weapon, this incredibly destructive weapon, and we will use it, and you better not get in our way. And Stalin certainly took it that way because, he was aware of the bomb through spies. There was a network, so he was aware of it, even though the U.S. had never let him in, even though they were allies, right? It's kind of funny when I've been hearing, lately we've been hearing about these vaccines, right? And who is it? China apparently has spies who are trying to get the COVID vaccine or something like that, right? And to me, the real question is, well, why the hell is that secretive? This should be, an international, group, working on it together. And that was kind of Stalin's point. Like, we're allies. The British knew about it, and you never told me. So this idea then of atomic diplomacy, that the bomb was used to send a message to the Soviet Union, not necessarily as a way to end the war, because that wasn't really necessary. Japan was in desperate shape. The Soviet Union was about to come in, which the Japanese were terrified of. I mean, would you rather be defeated by the United States and this liberal capitalism, or would you rather the Soviet Union come in and tear your infrastructure apart for reparations, right? Oh, I thought you were going to say something. I'm sorry. So,
It's okay.
so what becomes interesting then, which I think is important, is kind of interesting, is the story is like how we went from that period right after the bomb was used to very quickly a place where huge majorities of Americans were now saying, oh, it was a good idea. And this is like, the way history is done, I think is very important. It goes back to, that old Orwell thing, right? Whoever controls the past controls the present and therefore the future. And Truman decided to control the past. And so in early 1948, he had one of his younger aides, McGeorge Bundy, a name very familiar if you studied the Vietnam War. And I think was he Henry Stimson's son-in-law or something like that, who was the Secretary of State, maybe, very famous statesman. He had some kind of connection there. Bundy drafted an article which was published, I think, in Harper's, if I'm not mistaken. And it was called,
It was Harper's.
It was Harper's, and it was like why I dropped the bomb or something very simple.
No,
like
it's actually the decision to drop the atomic bomb. It's the same as the
Alperovitz title. Okay.
Yeah, it's the same
and
title.
In it, what comes out important is Truman talks about what an agonizing decision it was, right? He doesn't want people to think he went into this cavalierly and killed all these people for no reason. He thought about it. And then the kind of money quotes are that he did it in order to avoid a war. And then this is really the important part. He said, which would have killed 1 million Americans. All right. I don't think anybody to this date I know Alperovitz, who had a team of researchers working on this. He worked on it for 30 years. I don't think anybody's ever come up with a document in which that number of casualties was ever thrown out there. I'm pretty sure. But it's why 1 million,
Well, that's a stunning number.
It's a stunning number.
That's actually more casualty. Like it was only 500,000 Americans which died in the war total.
Oh yeah, it was almost 2 or 3 times. Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, or double. Yeah.
Yeah. So that article, which they placed, like really abruptly changed everything, right? Americans now overwhelmingly supported the use of the bomb, thought it was necessary to save 1 million American lives. And it made Truman appear stronger. And he for not just for that reason, but he was reelected, right? So the way that history was used was really important. Now, Alperovitz in the 60s kind of popularized this. His first book was called Atomic Diplomacy in like 1965, and he was part of the New Left. He's trained as an economist, but he started studying this. And, that came out at the same time that people like Gabriel Coco and William Almond Williams and Walter Lefebvre and Lloyd Gardner and, Chomsky were writing. And this was like, he was kind of really at the forefront of this kind of revisionist, history of the Cold War. Because the narrative of the Cold War was that, the United States was saving the world from these brutal communists who were trying to take it over.
It's the Alperovitz's work, and particularly the big book, the decision to use the atomic bomb, is a real good case study and actually a propaganda campaign. Is that like they saw that they were, one, losing the American people, and then two, they were needing to engage the public in supporting like the Cold War. Basically, what was the Cold War? It's conflict in Greece, it's elections in France and Italy, it's things happening all over the world. And so they needed this propaganda campaign to sort of justify it and use the Soviet Union as the sort of villain. It's pretty fascinating. I actually dug up a quote by Alperovitz that came out the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb, it was in the New York Times, is what is important is whether when the bomb was used, the president and his top advisors understood that it was not required to avoid a long and costly invasion, as they later claimed, and as most Americans still believe. And to be really honest, my family, my grandfather and my great-grandfather are both World War II veterans, and my great-grandfather, was on the staff of Joseph Stilwell, who was partially involved in the war planning. And my
Vinegar Joe, I didn't know that.
Yeah, my great-grandfather was actually part of the war planning team. And so the story that's been passed down in my family is that it was 1 million Americans were saved because we didn't invade Japan, which is now, complete like propaganda.
Yeah, well, Alperovitz's book is actually The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. It's actually two books. Book one is about the bombing, which we just went over the chronology and all that. And then book two, which I find really fascinating, is actually what you just pointed out. It's this kind of the way that the history was created, the propaganda behind it. And what I found really striking in that was the military's opposition to the bomb, as we've talked about before. That's an area I've studied extensively. I wrote a book on the U.S. military criticizing the Vietnam War very, very harshly, in fact. And so the idea that, because we have this, especially on the left, we have this image of the military, they're all a bunch of like crackpot, killer, and some of them are. But these guys, they understood, I think, the nature of war far better than civilians like Truman did. And so Eisenhower, George Marshall, LeMay, the admiral who was FDR's main aide, I can't remember his name now, Leahy, all of these guys were pretty clear in opposing the war. It wasn't, and this is kind of similar to what I found in Vietnam, the civilians were far more hawkish and aggressive in this particular instance. Now, the propaganda worked, right? Americans bought it, they accepted it. It created even more intense fear and hatred of the Soviet Union. It ratcheted up the Cold War. It made it possible to create this massive arms race. The United States developed, the Soviet Union developed its own A-bomb in, I think, 1950. The US developed a hydrogen bomb at the same time. I should have gotten the numbers. By 1960, just 10 years later, I think the United States had something like 16,000 nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union had, I think, less than 1,000, something like that. It's this overwhelming capacity. At the same time, Kennedy was talking about a missile gap. And this can all be traced back, I think, to the decision to use the atomic bomb, and then the aftermath of it. When they created this history, there's still a lot of good stuff coming out. It's still highly controversial. In 1995, I think, which would have been the 50th anniversary, or maybe it was 1990 for the 45th, it doesn't matter. The Smithsonian was going to put an exhibit up about the atomic bomb. The decision to use
It was
the bomb.
95. It was 95.
It was 95 for the 50th. Okay, so, and if you've ever been in a museum, they have the panels there which give you the history of it along with pictures or whatever. And part of the narrative, the script, suggested, it simply said, some people believe that the bomb was used as a signal to the Soviet Union. It didn't say that was the case. It just said some people believe that. A group of Air Force veterans, some Air Force vets groups went nuts. They ended up like creating such a problem that the Smithsonian canceled the entire exhibit, right? So this is still difficult to talk about. Now, if you read the scholarship on it, and one area where I've read actually quite a bit, there's a lot of good stuff on this. There's stuff about Stalin and the bomb. There's stuff about the Germans and the bomb, Japan, everything else. People who study this closely, including like the official historians from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, pretty much buy into the Alperovitz, the atomic diplomacy argument. I think among people who study it, but in the public, like you said, if you talk to your grandparents or somebody who just whatever, they're going to say it saved a million lives. A very well-known historian named Paul Fussell wrote a book called "Thank God for the Atomic Bomb" based on that. He was, I think, he was on a ship where he was afraid he was going to be sent to Japan, and he didn't. So Truman saved his life, right? So I think as we look back on this in the 75th anniversary of the atomic bomb, these are really important lessons. And I think some people may have this vague idea. It's not a conspiracy. It's not some kind of conspiracy theory. It's policy. It's not, why not, right? If you have the ability to use this to send a message to a rival country. So I think atomic diplomacy is actually become kind of among people who study it. Now there's another interpretation, which is kind of called the momentum argument, which I think makes some sense too. You've just spent a couple $1 billion and 4 years, and you've had the greatest minds ever working on this. You can't not use it, right? You can't just stick it in the garage, And then there are others who say, well, even though it was horrific, it was a good deterrent. Since then, no one's used an atomic bomb because they know what will happen if they do. Who knows? But I think it's important to talk about this, and especially I think the story behind it. How this history was created. And Alperovitz is very good on that. He's outstanding. It's a slog. It's a lot of reading, but it's good stuff.
One thing I'll say, this is just like a side note to the propaganda campaign, is that there's actually a new book out called The Beginning of the End: How Hollywood and America stopped worrying and loved the bomb. It's by a journalist and author, Greg Mitchell, who's written in The Nation. It's basically about, there were actually competing scripts, and a member of the Manhattan Project, who was a chemist named Ed Tompkins, who had actually been a high school teacher, wrote to a former pupil who was actress Donna Reed, trying to get this script kind of to impress upon the public the horrors of atomic warfare. And then, the politicians and whoever else got wind of this, and it became this sort of like competition, and the movie basically got made. It's called The Beginning or the End, and it jettisoned all the scientists' concerns and just basically added all kinds of details and deleted inconvenient facts and bowed to government pressure that basically like went along with like the Truman, Stimson, Burns, whoever else sort of like propaganda campaign. So it's a brand new book that's just come out this year. Folks should check it out.
Yeah, and I mean, the first movies that were kind of critical were like On the Beach and Strangelove. Those were in the early 60s, right? Yeah, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was really important in that. But I mean, the arms race can also be linked to this very clearly, right? Because the arms race really, is kind of the X factor in all this. The amount of money spent on weapons, we're talking about mega trillions over the years, was actually directly connected to this story of the atomic bomb. So there's a lot riding on getting that narrative out there. The bomb was necessary. It's a good thing, atomic power. And this is also goes on with civilian atomic power, right? How it was portrayed as clean energy. And this is how we got 3 Mile Island. And, I forget, what's the plane out your way?
Diablo Canyon.
Diablo Canyon, yeah. So this is all connected to the events of the spring and summer of 1945. And, when you look at it, and, I always tell my students, you can make your own mind up about this. But when you look at that narrative, how in February you're saying, okay, you're going to come in 3 months, and then the war ends in May, which would make your entry in August, and then conveniently you drop the bomb just as this other country is going to, declare war. So it's not, like I said, it's not a conspiracy. It makes a lot of sense, and it's being done for really succeeded if you believe in kind of American hegemony and the military-industrial complex and military Keynesianism and the national security state. And we could talk about this, endlessly, right? Because this is all connected to that: the national security state, the National Security Act, military Keynesianism, the draft, the permanent military economy, a garrison state, the kinds of things we're seeing today, with thugs on the street of Portland, aren't, they haven't just been thought of. Those aren't new and original ideas. So it's part of the state using its power to create a narrative against people and people's movements. So, this I think it's gone well. I hope you folks, out there watching this enjoy it. We'll try to do more of these. So
we hope you enjoyed seeing us in person. Yeah. Versus just hearing our voices.
Scott's good looking. I'm kind of rough. So, and follow us on all our media.
Yeah, we are Green and Red Podcast. Scott Park and Bob Bazenko. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can become a Patreon at patreon.com/Green Red Podcast, or go to our website and make a donation at greenandredpodcast.org. And it's been great talking with all of you, and we'll talk to you soon.